Rain hammered Highway 94 like it had a personal grievance against the asphalt. The kind of rain that doesn't visit the Arizona desert often, but when it does, it comes carrying everything it has been saving up. Lightning split the sky in irregular intervals, turning the flat black horizon white for a heartbeat before the darkness reclaimed it. Thunder followed each flash like something large being dragged across a stone floor. The kind of night that made sensible people stay indoors and thank whatever they believed in that they were not out on the road. The screen is black. Then the sound arrives first. Gunfire. Rapid. The percussion of weapons punching through glass and drywall in 40 years of someone's life. Then breaking glass. Then the rain again, finding its way through the holes where windows used to be. And underneath all of it, low and controlled, the sound of a man's breathing. The kind of breathing that is not calm, but has been built to function in the absence of calm. The kind you learn when panic is something you cannot afford. A voice comes through the darkness, unhurried. The voice of someone who has seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by what it produces. Some men spend their whole lives running from who they are. Holt Dawson had been running for 40 years. Tonight, the road finally ran out. The image rises slowly. A diner, or what used to be a diner. The walls are punched through with bullet holes. A ceiling fan turns overhead, one blade gone, the remaining three wobbling through their rotation with a persistence that seems almost willful. Broken coffee mugs on the linoleum. A pie case with the glass shattered inward, apple filling spread across the floor like something that had been trying to get out. Neon light from the sign outside pulsing red through the smoke painting, everything the color of a warning that came too late. In the middle of all of it, a man on his knees. He is not a small man. 58 years old, built by decades of work that asks more from the body than most people ever ask of theirs. Gray in the dark hair. A jaw that looks like it was made to hold a certain kind of expression and has held it long enough that the expression has become the face. Hands that are large and scarred and pressed hard against the chest of another man lying still on the floor. The man on the floor is older, 63 perhaps, a gray beard reaching his collarbone, an Irish face carrying decades of weather in its lines. His eyes are open and looking up at the man above him, and what is in them is not fear. It is something that costs more than fear to arrive at. Something that looks from the outside like a man who has finished what he needed to finish and is at peace with that. The kneeling man has blood on both hands. He is pressing down with everything he has, and it is not enough, and he knows it. Stay with me. His voice is the trained voice, the one constructed over years for exactly this kind of moment, the one that does not crack and does not beg. I'm not finished with you yet, old man. You stay with me. You hear me? You stay. The older man's lips move. No sound comes, only the shape of words. The younger man leans down until they are close. Freeze. The image holds. The hands, the blood, the spinning fan, the rain through the broken walls. Words appear on the black that follows. 14 hours earlier, the morning came up the way Arizona mornings do in late October. There is no gentleness to a desert dawn. It arrives like something that has been holding itself at the edge of the earth, impatient, and when it comes, it floods the sky all at once with burnt orange and deep rose and a thin, cold light that makes everything look simultaneously beautiful and indifferent. Holt Dawson was already awake when it arrived. He had been awake since 3 in the morning, which was not unusual. Sleep was not something Holt did so much as something that sometimes happened to him, and rarely without cost. He sat on the edge of a motel bed in Phoenix, elbows on his knees, the Colt 1911 broken down into its components on the nightstand beside him. He had done this since the Gulf, since those 18 months in the desert, where everything that could kill you was either buried in the ground beneath your feet or waiting in the vehicle 2 lanes over on a road that looked exactly like every other road. The ritual of disassembly had become something other than readiness over the years, though it was still that. It had become the most reliable way he knew to be honest about what he carried. You looked at each piece. You acknowledged its function. You put it back together, and you knew what you held. His hands moved with the authority of a man who had performed the same sequence so many thousands of times that his hands no longer required direction from his mind. They simply proceeded. He looked at his right wrist while they worked. The tattoo had been there for 10 years. He had gotten it in the weeks following a particularly bad stretch of nights. Nights where he woke up reaching for something with no name heart going hard against his ribs. He had dreamed a set of coordinates with such clarity and such repetition that he had eventually done what seemed like the only available response. He made them permanent. If they were going to live in his head every night, they could live on his skin during the day as well. 33.4512 degrees north, 112.0889 degrees west. He had never looked them up, not once in 10 years. He could not have explained why, except that some part of him had decided without making a conscious decision that wherever those numbers pointed was not somewhere he was ready to go. He assembled the pistol, checked the chamber, set it on the nightstand. He lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. He had dreamed again last night. The dream never changed. Fire. The smell of smoke so immediate that he sometimes woke up checking his clothes for burns. Screaming somewhere in the distance, the kind that goes on too long and then stops in a way that is worse than the screaming. And a voice, a woman's voice, not young and not old, calling a name through the fire and the smoke and the distance between them. Jake. He did not know anyone named Jake. He had never known anyone named Jake. He had woken at 3 in the morning with that name in his ears and the smell of smoke in his nose, and he had sat on the edge of the bed and held the Colt and taken it apart and put it back together and waited for the feeling to pass the way a man waits for pain to move through him. With patience, with the practiced understanding that it will end eventually, even when eventually feels a long way off. A knock at the door, 2 raps, a pause, 1 more. Holt rose, pulled on a shirt that had seen better decades. Opened the door. Seamus Reardon had the kind of face that people trusted immediately without being able to explain why. 63 years old. The gray beard reached his collarbone and moved when he walked. Eyes the color of sea glass, a green that had faded over time into something quieter and more useful. He was from County Clare originally, though you had to listen carefully now to find it beneath 35 years of American roads and Arizona sun, and the particular rhythm that settles into a man's voice when he has spent more nights in the open air than inside 4 walls. He held 2 cups of coffee, passed one through the door without comment. "You look like hell," he said, not unkindly. "Early morning," Holt said. Seamus studied him with those pale green eyes. The look lasted a moment longer than the surface of it required, which was something Seamus did when he was measuring one thing against another, checking an internal calculation. "Bad one, same one." Seamus nodded, sipped his coffee, did not push further. This was one of the reasons Holt had trusted this man for 15 years. Seamus Reardon understood the difference between a question that would help and a question that would only disturb the scar tissue around something that was trying to heal. He had a precise sense of when silence was more useful than words. They stood in the doorway and watched the sun finish coming up. The Phoenix skyline had the look of a city that could not decide whether it was building towards something or simply accumulating. New glass beside old concrete. The desert pressing in at every edge. When Holt turned back inside to find his jacket, Seamus reached into the inside pocket of his vest. The motion was slow and deliberate, the motion of a man checking that something important is still where he left it. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, looked at it for a moment, then folded it back and returned it to the pocket. He pressed his hand flat against his chest over it for just a moment before releasing. Holt was pulling on his jacket and did not see this. He ran a thumb over the patch on the back. Iron Wolves, Phoenix chapter. The wolf's head in black and gray. Below it in smaller letters, the word that had defined his life for 11 years. President. He had worn this jacket until it fit him the way a second skin fits, shaped by the specific angles of the man inside. The bikes were in the lot, 8 of them. Heritage Classics and Road Kings, and 1 Electroglide that belonged to Rex and carried more chrome than was strictly necessary. They sat in a row in the October chill, and they looked like what they were. The property of men who had decided at various points in their lives that the road was the one thing that had never lied to them. "Mount up," Holt said. The engines came to life in sequence, each one a particular voice in the larger chord. They moved out of the lot and turned north and became as they always did once they were moving something with its own momentum, its own weight, its own direction. The rain started an hour outside Phoenix, light at first, then heavier. Seamus pulled alongside. Holt glanced over. Holt kept his eyes on the road. Rain was rain. You rode through it or you stayed home. He had never developed the habit of staying home. They rode through it. Highway 94 north of the city is a road that makes no apologies. It does not curve to offer scenery. It does not soften. It simply proceeds straight and without sentiment through land that was here before the road and will be here after the road is a memory. Scrub and rock, and the occasional saguaro standing in the rain like a man who has been waiting so long for something that he has stopped expecting it to come and has become instead simply part of what is there. Then through the rain and the dark, a light. Neon. Red and gold cycling between the 2 colors without resolution, as if still deciding. A sign above a low building set back from the road. The kind of building that looks like it grew from the land rather than being built on it. A flat roof, weathered walls, a parking lot of cracked asphalt where the painted lines had surrendered to time and weather. Calloway's Diner. Holt pulled in. The others followed. He sat on the bike for a moment without moving. He was not a man who sat in the rain without reason, but there was something about this place that he could not name and did not try to name. A quality to the air, or to the light, or to some register of experience below the ones he had language for. He attributed it to the cold and the long ride and the bad night behind him and swung off the bike. He pushed through the door. The inside of the diner smelled like coffee and grease and something that took him a moment to place. Not just apple. Apple and cinnamon. Fresh cinnamon, the kind that means someone baked in the last few hours, and the smell of it has had time to settle into the walls and the furniture and the air itself. Fluorescent lights overhead. 6 booths along the window wall. A counter with 8 stools, 3 of them cracked along the vinyl seating. A pie case on 3 tiers. Behind the counter, a coffee pot large enough to suggest that the people this diner served required serious quantities. A photograph of the Arizona desert in a wooden frame slightly crooked on the wall above the pass-through to the kitchen. And behind the counter, a woman. She was 78 years old, and she looked like someone had constructed her from the same material as the land outside. Not frail, not any of the things that a person might assume about 78 years. Her white hair was pulled back with an efficiency that suggested this had been the arrangement every morning for decades and was not a decision that required revisiting. Her hands did not shake when she reached for the coffee pot. They were the hands of someone who had done the same work in the same place for so long that the work had become part of the body inseparable from it. Her eyes were different. Her eyes held the specific quality of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has declined at every point, when declining would have been reasonable to stop waiting. Whatever she was waiting for had not come. She had kept waiting. The patience in those eyes was not passive. It was the most active thing in the room. When the door opened and the 8 of them came in shaking water from their jackets and filling the entry with the smell of leather and rain and engines, she looked up. Her hand went still on the coffee pot. Not from fear, from something she did not immediately have a category for. Holt came to the counter first. He stopped a respectful distance back, far enough not to crowd, close enough to be heard over the rain. Counter or booth? She said it before he opened his mouth. Her voice was even, long accustomed to the question. Booths, Holt said. If that's all right, he paused. We'll be quiet. Just need coffee and something hot. Seamus appeared at Holt's shoulder. He pulled at the gray beard with the expression of a man conducting a genuine internal deliberation. And pie, if there is any, Seamus said. The county clerk still present in his vowels worn, but not gone. This one has been talking about pie for the last 100 miles. Apple, the woman said. Made it this morning. She was looking at Seamus when she said it. Then her eyes moved to Holt and stayed there a moment longer than the situation called for. The way a person looks at a face they believe they have seen somewhere else in a different context, a different year, a different version of the world. She turned for the coffee pot. Holt gestured to his men. They moved to the booths with the economy of people accustomed to occupying whatever space they are given, without complaint. Rex took the outside of the first booth and produced his phone. Decker leaned his head back against the wall. Torchenstone took the far booth and resumed a conversation in the shorthand of men who have been talking to each other for years and have stopped needing complete sentences. Holt and Seamus took the booth nearest the door. Holt sat with his back to the wall. He looked at the windows, at the emergency exit beside the kitchen, at the gap behind the counter where a person could get in 30 seconds if the situation changed. He was not doing this consciously. He had stopped doing it consciously a long time ago. It was the way his eyes moved when he entered a room, like a compass needle seeking north automatic, requiring nothing from conscious thought except permission to proceed. The coffee arrived on a tray of 8 mugs, not a drop lost despite the weight, despite the water still finding its way under the door. She set them down with the authority of someone who has been doing this long enough that the tray is an extension of the arm. She placed the last mug in front of Holt. He looked up. Their eyes met. Something happened that Holt would not have been able to describe if someone had asked him immediately afterward. A flicker, as though a light went on briefly in a room he had not known was there. Present, and then gone fast enough that he might have attributed it to the fluorescent light overhead, or the long ride, or the hours since 3 in the morning. He was good at attributing things to other causes. He had been doing it for 58 years. Thank you, ma'am. He wrapped both hands around the mug. The warmth moved through his knuckles. He could feel the slight roughness where the glaze had worn at the rim from years of washing. "You boys been riding long," Phoenix Holt said. "Taking the weather slow." He drank, closed his eyes for a moment, opened them. "Good coffee. 42 years of practice," she said. "You learn the things you need to learn." She was turning back toward the kitchen. Something in the set of her shoulders produced in Holt a feeling that arrived without a name and departed before he could find one. Not recognition exactly, something adjacent to it. The feeling of a word positioned just past reach. The feeling of something almost remembered, which is its own particular kind of discomfort because it suggests there is something there to remember. He drank his coffee. Across the table, Seamus was watching him with the peripheral attention that looked casual and was not. The pie came out on 8 separate plates, 2 trips, no complaint. A lattice crust, the precise gold of something, pulled from the oven at exactly the right moment, and on top, dusted over the surface, cinnamon. Not a modest amount, enough to be a decision rather than an accident. Holt looked at his plate. He looked at the woman who was moving to refill cups at the far booths. "How'd you know?" he said. She stopped, turned, looked at him. "Know what? That I like it with extra cinnamon." The question sat between them. The woman went still in a way that was different from before. This was the stillness of something reaching in and finding the center of a person. "Lucky guess," she said. She moved away. But her hands on the coffee pot were not entirely steady, and she did not look back at his booth for a long moment. Holt picked up his fork, cut a piece, ate it. He set the fork down, sat with his hands in his lap. The taste was not simply the taste of apple and pastry and spice. There was something underneath those elements. Something in the specific balance of sweetness against warmth that his palate understood as correct before his mind had caught up to the question of why. The way a melody can reach you before you recognize what song it is. The way a smell can move you to a feeling that has no memory attached to it, but is clearly the residue of one. He looked at nothing in particular. Seamus had stopped eating. He was looking at Holt with an expression that was not readable from the outside. "Something remind you of something?" Seamus asked. Holt picked up the fork again. "Don't know," he said. "Can't remember." He said it because it was true. There were presences in his mind that had no content, shapes without substance, the outline of things that should be memories and were not. He had lived with them for long enough to stop expecting them to resolve. He ate the rest of the pie. The rain intensified. The windows ran with water, and the parking lot outside became a shallow lake, reflecting the neon in long wavering lines, red and gold, red and gold. Thunder moved closer. The men at the back booths finished their food, and most of them were asleep or close to it within the hour. The road takes what it takes, and when you stop moving, the debt comes due. Holt had taken out his phone, was looking at something on it with the kind of focus that was trying to look like casual attention and was not. He looked at the tattoo on his wrist. He put the phone face down on the table. He picked it up again. Across the table, Seamus was watching the parking lot through the rain-blurred window with an expression that was elsewhere. Then the bell above the door chimed. The sound the room made was not a sound exactly. It was a change in quality, the way the air in a room adjusts when something enters it that changes the nature of the space. 5 men came in from the rain. They were not travelers. They did not have the particular looseness of people who have been driving and are glad to stop. They moved with the precision of people who are accustomed to being the most significant presence in whatever room they occupy and have not been corrected on this assumption. The man in front was 54 years old. Silver hair carried back from a broad forehead, a face that was handsome in the structural sense, everything placed correctly, nothing out of alignment. His eyes were a gray so pale it was nearly colorless, and they moved across the room the way eyes move when they are not admiring what they see, but assessing what it is worth. Garrett Holloway. The woman behind the counter had gone still, in a way that was different from all the previous stillnesses. This was the stillness of someone who has been bracing for a particular thing and is now in the specific displeasure of having been right. Holloway crossed to the counter. His 4 men arranged themselves behind him with the practiced spacing of people who have done this before. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice was smooth and even the voice of a man who has given a version of this same speech enough times to have refined it past the point where it sounds like a speech. "Beautiful evening, isn't it? It's pouring rain, Mr. Holloway." He smiled. A matter of perspective. One of his men produced a folder. Holloway set it on the counter without opening it. "I'll come straight to the point. My company has been doing survey work in this area. The ground you're on has significant mineral value, copper deposits and possibly more." He slid the folder forward an inch. "I'm prepared to offer you $4.2 million. Cash, Full transfer. You could retire. Move somewhere that doesn't require you to work 70-hour weeks at 78 years old. He said her age with a precision that was not accidental. The woman did not touch the folder. Not interested. Mrs. Calloway. I said no. You haven't looked at the offer. I don't need to. Her voice was quiet and certain in the way that things are quiet and certain when they have been tested many times and have not moved. This diner was built by my husband. He put every board in place with his own hands on land we saved 6 years to buy. We raised our son in this kitchen. This place holds everything I have left of both of them. It is not for sale, not for 4 million, not for 40. Something moved across Holloway's face, fast, a ripple on water that appeared and was gone. Then the composed expression returned, practiced and smooth. I understand, he said. Sentiment. That deserves respect. He produced a business card with 2 fingers and set it on the counter with the precision of a man placing a piece on a board. But circumstances change. People reconsider. The offer stands for 48 hours. When you're ready, that number reaches me directly. He turned toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at her with the attentiveness of a man who wants to be certain his message has arrived correctly. 48 hours, Mrs. Calloway. After that, opportunities of this kind tend not to come twice. He left. His men followed. The door swung shut and the bell chimed, and the sound of it seemed diminished, made smaller by what had preceded it. The business card sat on the counter. At the booth nearest the door, Holt had not moved, had not eaten since Holloway walked in. He had watched the entire exchange with the quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has spent enough time in situations where moving at the wrong moment was the last mistake you made. His coffee mug was in both hands, and his eyes were on the door, and his hands were relaxed, not ready, just present. After a long moment, he set the mug down, rose from the booth, crossed to the counter, stopped at a respectful distance from the woman who was still looking at the door. You know that man, he said, by reputation. What kind of reputation? The kind that gets what it wants, she said. One way or another, her voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has said a difficult thing enough times that the difficulty has worn smooth. How long have you been running this alone? 15 years. Since my husband passed. Family nearby, her throat moved. No, she said. No family. She said it as a complete statement. The truth of it was total. The loneliness in it was not fresh. It had been carried long enough to become part of the load rather than something separate from it. Holt looked at Seamus. Seamus looked back. The exchange that happens between men who have ridden enough miles together to have developed a shared language of glances, a language that does not require words because words would only slow it down. We'll stay tonight, Holt said to the woman, just to make sure everything stays quiet. She looked at him. You don't have to do that. No, ma'am, but we're going to. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Something moved through her face that was complicated and old. The expression of a woman who has been carrying something alone for so long that having someone offer to simply stand nearby was not just a practical kindness, but something that touched a place she had kept very carefully protected. I don't have money to pay you, she said. Didn't ask for any. He said it with the simplicity of a man who means exactly what he says and no more. Just tell me where the bikes can stay dry, and maybe another pot of coffee when you have a moment. She was quiet for a second. Then there's a garage out back. She paused. It hasn't been used as a garage for a long time. There's a motorcycle in there. A Harley Sportster, 1984. I keep it maintained. Oil changed every year. Battery fresh. She stopped. There's room for yours alongside it, something in the way she said it, not as an afterthought, as a thing she had been holding in readiness for a specific occasion without knowing when the occasion would come. That'll do, Holt said. He gave Rex and Decker their instructions for the first watch. 2-hour rotations. Stay sharp, stay visible. They moved without discussion with the efficiency of men who had done this in various forms in various places and had learned that clarity of instruction was more valuable than explanation of reasoning. Seamus remained. He settled back into the booth with his coffee and his beard and the watchful quality of attention that had been his most useful feature for 63 years. The woman behind the counter made a fresh pot. The rain kept coming down. The hands of the clock above the counter moved. The other men slept. Outside, Rex and Decker walked their rotations in the rain with the patient thoroughness of men who understood that nothing happening was itself a kind of information that required maintenance. Ruth came back to the front of the counter, moved along it with a cloth wiping surfaces that had already been wiped. The motion of hands that needed occupation while the mind worked through something. Holt watched her. The specific angle of her head when she listened to the rain, the way she held the cloth, the particular economy of her movements, the result of 42 years of performing the same actions in the same space until the body had internalized them completely. He was not doing this consciously. "You have bad dreams," she said. She did not look up from the counter when she said it. Holt looked at her. "Every night," he said. "Same ones. Long as I can remember." She had stopped wiping. Her hands were flat on the counter. "What do you dream about?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that Seamus glanced over. Fireholt said, "Smoke, screaming, and a woman's voice calling a name." The cloth on the counter came to rest. The woman's hands pressed flat against the laminate surface as if she needed the resistance of something solid. "What name?" she said, very quietly. "Jake." The mug slipped from her hands. Holt caught it, set it down with a care that was disproportionate to the task, as if placing it gently enough back on the counter could undo the moment that had caused the motion. The woman stood with both hands on the counter, her knuckles white, her face doing something complicated and controlled the expression of a person running an enormous amount of feeling through a body that has had 40 years of practice at managing it. "You all right?" Holt asked. She breathed, looked at him. "That name," she said. "Jake. It was my son's name." The fluorescent light overhead continued its single persistent note. The rain found the roof. A piece of the damaged trim outside moved in the wind, its scraping irregular and small. Was Holt said. "He disappeared 40 years ago," she said. "He was 18. There was a fire at a psychiatric hospital in Phoenix. Millbrook. They told us he was there. They said he died in the fire, but they never found his body." She stopped. "They never found any real evidence. They declared him dead and they closed the case. And you didn't believe them." "I never did. Not for one day." She pressed her hand flat against her chest. "I have known for 40 years that my son is alive somewhere." She said it without desperation, without the quality of someone who needs to be believed. She said it the way a person states a fact that is as solid to them as any physical object. Not argued, simply known. The room was quiet. Seamus had gone completely still on the other side of the booth. The kind of still that is a decision rather than a state. Holt said, "Your son, Jake, what was he like?" She smiled. The first smile since they had arrived, and it transformed her face completely. Under the years and the waiting and the weight of everything she had been carrying, the smile was the face of a woman who had loved someone without condition or reservation and had never stopped. "Smart," she said, "curious about everything. He loved motorcycles from the time he was small. Used to take apart engines just to understand how they worked, then put them back together. He could fix anything with his hands, build anything." She paused. He was going to enlist. Had it all planned out. He was going to enlist in November and serve and then come back and work on bikes. He had it so clear in his mind what his life was going to be. She stopped. And then one day he was just gone. Holt stood. He walked to the window, stood with his back to the room and looked at the rain on the parking lot at the neon light, making its red and gold patterns on the surface of the standing water. He said without turning, "I don't remember anything before I was 8 years old. Nothing at all. They told me I was in a fire, that my parents died, that I was the only one who came out. They gave me a name and put me in the foster system, and that was the whole story." Behind him, he heard the quality of the woman's breathing change. When she asked, "1984, he said. "Phoenix." He heard her take a step. He turned. She was looking at him the way a person looks when they are seeing two things in the same place at the same time. The man in front of her and the face beneath the man, the face that had been here before younger, before the years and the roads and the war and the decades of living, had changed its surface without changing what was underneath it. "No," Holt said. He said it quietly, without anger. "I know what you're thinking, and you're wrong. I'm not. I can't be." "How do you know?" she said. "Because I would remember my own mother. Not if they made you forget." She said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has had 40 years to think through every possibility and has arrived at this one not through hope, but through the process of eliminating everything that could not account for what she knew to be true. Holt's hands were trembling, not much. He pressed them flat against his thighs. "I need some air." He grabbed his jacket, pushed through the door. The rain hit him immediately and completely. He stood in the middle of the parking lot and let it. The water soaked through his shirt in under a minute. He did not move. He stood in the rain and looked at his right wrist. The tattoo. The coordinates that had been on his skin for 10 years. that he had looked at every morning and set aside without asking the question they were waiting for. He pulled out his phone. The screen beaded water. He unlocked it, opened the map. He typed the numbers. 33.4512 north, 112.0889 west. The map shifted. His location dot moved to center. The red pin dropped. He stared at the screen. He rotated the phone and looked at the label attached to the pin. Callaway's Diner, Highway 94. He looked up at the building in front of him. The neon sign, the low roof, the window where a woman with white hair stood very still watching him through the glass, her hands at her sides not moving, waiting the way she had been waiting for 40 years. He went down on one knee in the gravel. Not from weakness, from the weight of something that had been over his head without his knowing it, invisible, and accumulated and had just become visible all at once. His phone was still in his hand, and the red pin was still on the screen, and the pin was sitting precisely on the spot where he was kneeling in the rain. He stayed there. The rain came down. The neon cycled. Red and gold, red and gold. He thought about the pie, about the specific balance of sweetness and cinnamon that his body had recognized as correct before his mind had any way to account for that recognition. He thought about the coffee black ordered without thinking, the way he always ordered it, and the way it had tasted like something true, in a way that good coffee does not ordinarily taste. He thought about the dream, the fire, the smoke, the voice moving through it toward him and calling a name he did not own. He thought about the scar behind his left ear, a childhood scar, the Foster record said, from before the fire. He had never questioned it. He had never questioned any of it, because when a person has no before the story they are given about the before is the only story there is. He thought about the motorcycle in the garage, a Sportster, 1984, maintained every year, battery fresh, oil changed, kept ready for a specific occasion that had not come and had not been given up on. He pressed his free hand into the wet gravel. He asked himself the question that had been underneath every other question for 58 years. Who am I? The answer was not a relief. It was the opposite of relief. Because if the woman at the window was right, if the coordinates on his wrist and the cinnamon and the scar and the dream and all the years of riding roads that led somewhere but never anywhere, that felt like it belonged to him, were all pointing at the same thing, then he had spent 58 years being the person someone else had decided to make, and the person he actually was had been here, right here, waiting to be found. He stood, walked back to the diner, pushed through the door. She was standing at the window where she had been watching him. She turned when she heard him come in. He stood in the entry, soaked, and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment long enough to hold 40 years inside it. He said, "Your son. Were there any other marks, scars, anything specific enough to not be a coincidence?" She walked toward him slowly. The way you walk towards something you have waited a very long time for and are now afraid in the final distance to reach. A scar, she said, behind his left ear. He was 7 years old, fell off his bicycle in the driveway. 4 stitches. She paused. And a birthmark, right shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon. Holt reached up with his right hand, touched the small ridge of scar tissue behind his left ear. He had always had it. He watched her face while he reached back with his other hand and pulled the collar of his jacket and shirt away from his right shoulder. He could not see the mark. He did not need to see it. He saw her face. He saw the exact moment she saw it. He saw what 40 years of refusing to stop believing looks like when it arrives. When the thing that was waited for is actually here, and actual, and present, and real, and the waiting is over, and the knowledge of that moves through a person's body from the place where it has been held all the way to the surface. She went down. He caught her before she reached the floor. He held her up, this woman he had met 4 hours ago in a diner on a highway in the Arizona desert. This stranger who was not a stranger. This woman whose voice had been the voice in his dreams every night of his life. And she looked up at him, and her eyes were doing the thing they had been doing for 40 years, the thing that was neither grief nor hope, but the specific sustained certainty of someone who knew a thing was true and had never been given proof and had kept knowing anyway. He did not say he believed it. He was not ready to say that. He was 58 years old, and he had ridden 100,000 miles and survived a war and built something real out of very little, and he was standing in a desert diner in a rainstorm, holding a woman who had been waiting here for him while he rode every road in America that was not this one. And the coordinates on his wrist pointed at the floor under his feet, and the extra cinnamon had tasted like home before he had any language for what home was. Somewhere below reason, below argument, below the 58 years of living as someone else, something was moving, old and slow and deliberate, the way a river moves under ice, the way something returns to its original direction when the thing that had been blocking it is finally removed. He did not let go of her. And at that moment, Seamus Reardon, who had been sitting very still in the booth nearest the door, with his hands around his coffee mug and his pale green eyes watching everything reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out the folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, the handwriting on the outside. The address he had carried for 2 months, the address of this diner sent to him through an intermediary by a woman who had heard that someone was asking questions about Millbrook. A woman who had spent 40 years asking the same questions and had recognized in the pattern of Seamus's inquiries the shape of someone who was close to the truth. He had carried this paper from Phoenix tonight because 3 years of careful private research had finally given him enough. Enough to believe. Enough to act. He had not told Holt, not because he was protecting him from the truth, but because he understood something fundamental about the man across the booth. Some truths have to be arrived at. They cannot be delivered. They have to be earned by the person who needs them through the process of arriving, of opening the right door, of standing in the rain, and finally looking up the coordinates that have been on your wrist for 10 years. Seamus folded the paper back, placed it on the table, looked at Holt, who was across the room holding a woman he was not yet ready to call his mother. Outside at the far edge of the parking lot, headlights appeared. They sat there for a moment, pointed at the diner. Then they went dark. The night had not finished with them. Not even close. On the wall behind the counter, the clock moved to a new hour. 46 hours remaining. Seamus Reardon had a particular way of making phone calls that he did not want overheard. He stepped outside. He walked to the far edge of whatever space he occupied. He spoke quietly, and he listened more than he spoke. And when he came back inside, his face told you nothing about what had been said, which was itself a kind of information. He had been outside for 22 minutes. Holt had used those 22 minutes to help Ruth to a chair, to bring her a glass of water she didn't drink, and to stand at the window watching the parking lot in the rain. The black car had not reappeared. This did not mean it was gone. It meant whoever was in it had decided that darkness and distance were more useful than proximity. Rex came in from the first watchwater, streaming from his jacket, and reported nothing unusual in a tone that meant he had found nothing yet, but was not confident that nothing was all there was to find. Holt sent him back out with Decker to rotate and told them to keep the bikes between themselves and the road. Ruth sat at the counter with her hands around the glass of water and looked at nothing in particular, with the expression of a woman who has just received the thing she spent 40 years asking for and is finding that arrival and readiness are not the same thing. Holt understood that. He was finding the same. When Seamus came back through the door, he pulled off his jacket, shook the water from it with one sharp motion, and hung it on the peg near the entry. He did not look at Holt immediately. He looked at the floor for a moment, the way a man looks at the floor when he is organizing what he is about to say and deciding which order the pieces belong in. Then he looked up. "Sit down," he said. Holt sat. Seamus came to the counter. He nodded at Ruth. She looked at him with those patient eyes, and he held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that Holt could not read. "I'm going to tell you something," Seamus said. He was looking at Holt now. "And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything, because some of it is going to be hard to sit still through, and I need you to sit still through it anyway." Holt said nothing, which was agreement. Seamus settled onto a counter stool, put both hands flat on the laminate. "Iron Wolves MC Phoenix chapters," he said. "Founded 1985. You know that. You've known that since before you were patched in. Club history. Chapter came out of nothing, put down roots, built itself up over 14 years before you came along in 1999. That's the story as you know it." He paused. "Let that land. What I found out tonight is that the story has a different version. The chapter was incorporated in January of 1985, filed under a John Smith of Phoenix, Arizona, which is either the most creative name anyone has ever used or the least. The founding members, all 7 of them, had bank accounts. Nothing unusual about that. What is unusual is that every single one of those accounts, going back to the beginning, had the same originating deposit, same source, same amount, routed through 3 different shells before it got to them, but when you follow it back far enough, it comes out of one place." He said the name. Gerald Holloway. The fluorescent light buzzed. Ruth closed her eyes, opened them. Holt said nothing. His face did not change. But his hands flat on the counter in front of him, pressed down slightly, as if he needed the resistance of a solid surface to keep the rest of him from moving. "Gerald Holloway." Seamus continued. "Garrett Holloway's father. built the mining operation from the ground up starting in the 1960s. By 1984, he was running copper, silver, and things that don't show up on any mining permit: human trafficking, money laundering on a scale that required the active cooperation of judges, city officials, law enforcement at multiple levels. He had half of Arizona in his pocket and the other half too scared to look directly at him. He died in 2009, Holt said. His voice was quiet. He did. Left the whole operation to his son. Garrett has spent the 15 years since then being more careful than his father, but no less committed to the enterprise. Holt looked at the counter. The man who vouched for me, he said. When I came into the chapter in 1999, Eric Baylor, Seamus looked at him steadily. Yes, Baylor died in 2003, bar fight in Tucson. That's the official account. Holt was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the flatness of a man saying a thing he already knows is true and is simply verifying it out loud because hearing it confirmed is the last step before having to live with it. He was on Holloway's payroll from at least 1997. My contact found 2 years of wire transfers before they went dark. After he died, the payments shifted, new names, but the same structure, the same source. He paused. 12 of the 23 current members have received money from Holloway's organization in the last 5 years. I have the accounts, I have the amounts. It is not ambiguous. 12, 12. Holt sat with that number. He did not look angry. He looked like a man who has been handed a map that shows him exactly how lost he has been and is working out with quiet precision what that means for every mile he thought he knew. Seamus leaned forward slightly. You were not brought into this chapter because you were the right man for it, he said. You were placed there, deliberately, by people who knew exactly who you were or who you had been and wanted to keep you where they could see you, close enough to monitor, far enough from the truth to never find it on your own. They built a world around you, Holt, a life, a brotherhood, and they put their people inside it to make sure it stayed the shape they needed it to be. He let that sit. They didn't just erase you, Seamus said. They kept you on a leash, and they've been holding the end of it this whole time. The rain on the roof was the only sound for a long moment. Then Holt said, How long have you known? Seamus did not look away from him. 3 years, he said. I had a conversation with a man who had worked for Gerald Holloway in the early 1980s. Old man, dying as it turned out, though he didn't know it yet. He was drinking more than he should have been, and he said something about a boy in Phoenix, a boy who had been taken out of a hospital and given a new life and a new name and put somewhere useful. He didn't know the details. He didn't know the name, but he knew the year and he knew the city and he knew enough about what Gerald Holloway was capable of that I started paying attention to things I had only been half looking at before. Why didn't you tell me? Holt said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question asked by a man who needed to understand. Seamus was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower. The professional distance he maintained through most conversations was gone. Because you built yourself, he said. Whatever they took from you, whoever you were before they got to it, you built something out of what you had left. Out of the war and the road and the brothers and the years, you built a person, a real one. And I was not going to walk up to that person and take a sledgehammer to the foundation until I was certain there was something solid enough under it to stand on once the dust settled. He paused. I needed you to find it yourself, son. A man has to stand on his own truth. I couldn't hand it to you like a wrapped gift. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Ruth. She had been sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes moving between them, listening with the complete attention of a woman who has been waiting for this conversation for 40 years and is hearing it for the first time and knows that every word matters. Tell me, Holt said. All of it. What happened? The real version. Ruth looked at him. She straightened. She set her hands flat on her thighs and she began. It was August of 1984, she said. Jake was 18. He had graduated in June. He was working at the garage on Meridian, saving money, had already talked to the Army recruiter twice. He was going to enlist in November. He had it all planned. She paused. When she continued, her voice was steady, in the way that things are steady when they have been held carefully for a very long time. He was at the Eastgate Mall, errand for me actually. I needed a part for the dishwasher, and there was a hardware store at the back of the lot. He was cutting through the parking structure on foot when he saw them. 3 men, a little girl, 7 years old. He watched them put her in the back of a van. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Her name was Lily Weston, she said. Her father was Senator Elias Weston, one of the most powerful men in Arizona at the time. The ransom demand came 2 days later. $5 million. The senator paid it. Lily never came home. But before any of that was known, Jake went to the police. That same day, he gave them the plate number off the van. He gave them descriptions of the men. He told them exactly what he had seen. And 48 hours later, she said they came to our door and told us Jake had suffered a psychiatric break, that he was experiencing violent delusions, that he had been committed to Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation and treatment, and that we should not attempt to contact him until the doctors cleared it. She looked at Holt. He was not delusional, she said. He was 18 years old and he had seen something he was not supposed to see. And the men he had described to the police were men who worked for Gerald Holloway. Holt said nothing. My husband David was a police officer, 22 years on the force. He started asking questions, the kind of questions that make people nervous when the person asking them is patient enough and smart enough to follow the answers wherever they lead. He found the connection between Holloway and the Millbrook administration. He found the shell companies. He found 3 judges who had received significant payments in cash in the 6 months before Jake's commitment. He found a city councilman, a records administrator in the county court, and 2 senior officers in his own precinct. She pressed her hands against her thighs. In November of 1984, she said David ran a red light on the way home from work and was struck by a semi-truck. He died at the scene. The truck driver was never identified. The company the truck was registered to had dissolved 3 weeks earlier. The case was closed inside of 30 days. Holt's jaw was tight. The muscle in the side of his face moved once and then was still. 2 weeks after David was buried, she said Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital burned to the ground. A fire that started in the electrical room according to the investigation. 41 patients were accounted for. Jake was not among them. They declared him dead. They said the fire was too hot, the destruction too complete, that there were simply some individuals who could not be positively identified. They sealed the case. She looked at him. There was a doctor at that hospital, she said. The chief of psychiatry, Dr. Aldous Crane. He had been running a research program at Millbrook for 6 years, funded through private channels that did not appear in the hospital's official budget. When the hospital burned, Dr. Crane disappeared along with it. No investigation, no follow-up. He simply ceased to exist. She paused. I have spent 40 years looking for Jake, she said. Looking for Dr. Crane, looking for anyone who could tell me what happened to my son. And I found nothing. Nothing except the certainty that he was still alive somewhere, that they needed him gone but not dead, that a dead boy is a martyr and a living ghost is something else entirely. She looked at Holt with the full weight of those 40 years behind her eyes. A living ghost, she said, is something you can use. The silence that followed held everything that had been said and everything that had not been said, and all the years between them that should not have been years of separation and were. Seamus cleared his throat. There's one more thing, he said. He looked at Ruth. She nodded, as if she had known this was coming. I started digging 3 years ago, he said. When the dying man told me what he knew, I went back to the beginning, the fire, the hospital, the records. He paused. What I found and what I have not told you until tonight, because I did not have enough of it to be useful, is that Millbrook was not simply a psychiatric hospital that was used as a convenient location to disappear an inconvenient witness. It was a facility, a specific kind of facility, set up to do a specific kind of work. He stopped, chose his next words carefully. Dr. Aldous Crane was not simply a doctor who participated in a cover-up, he said. He was a researcher. His work, funded by Gerald Holloway, was in experimental pharmacology and behavioral modification, specifically the permanent modification of autobiographical memory in young subjects, the erasure of identity, not the suppression of it, the erasure, the creation of a clean surface on which a new identity could be built. Holt was very still. You were not the first, Seamus said, and you were not the last. The clock on the wall behind the counter showed 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. Outside, the rain had not relented. The parking lot was a shallow lake. The neon sign cast its red and gold light on the surface of the water in long, wavering lines. Holt had stood from the counter at some point after Seamus finished speaking and had walked to the end of the room and stood with his back to them, looking at the wall at the photograph of the Arizona desert in its slightly crooked wooden frame. He had been standing there for several minutes. Neither Ruth nor Seamus had spoken. This was the particular grace of people who understand that some things need to be stood inside of before they can be talked about. The photograph showed the desert at sunrise, long shadows, the saguaros casting lines of darkness across the pale sand. a sky going from deep blue at the top to something close to gold at the horizon. It was beautiful and it was indifferent, and it was the kind of image that had been on that wall for long enough that it had stopped being a decoration and had become part of the room itself, as fixed and as permanent as the counter or the floor. Holt turned around. His face was composed. The kind of composed that is not calm, but is the architecture built over calm's absence, the structure that holds while whatever is underneath it works through itself. He sat back down at the counter. He looked at Seamus. He looked at Ruth. "Tell me about Seamus," he said. "What you two talked about before he came back inside." Ruth looked at Seamus. Seamus said, "She called me 2 months ago. She had heard through channels I did not know she had access to that someone had been asking questions about Millbrook, about the records from 1984, someone with a specific interest in a specific patient. She reached out through an intermediary. When I understood who she was, I agreed to come." He paused. "That's why we rode north tonight," Seamus said. "Not because of the rain and not because of chance. Because I made a decision 3 years ago that if I ever found enough of the truth, I was going to bring you here. And 2 months ago, she gave me the last piece I needed to believe that bringing you here was something I had the right to do." Holt looked at him for a long time. "I needed you to find it yourself," Seamus said again. "I stand by that." The muscle in Holt's jaw moved. He breathed. In, out. Then something in his shoulders let go of something they had been holding. "I know you do, old man," he said. "I know." He reached across the counter, picked up his coffee mug, drank what was left in it, which was cold. He looked at Ruth. "There were good ones," he said, "in the chapter. Among the 23. There were," Seamus said, "11 of them." Holt nodded. He thought about Rex outside in the rain, patient and steady and reliable in the way that a rock is reliable, in the way that the earth under your feet is reliable. He thought about Decker, who had ridden beside him in 3 states and through 2 situations that neither of them had expected to survive and had not complained once. He thought about Torch and Stone, the way they moved together, the shorthand of men who had earned each other's trust over years and miles of actual difficulty. He thought about the 12 on the other side of that number. 12 men he had shared food with, shared rides with, shared the kind of moments that are supposed to mean something. 12 men who had been watching him on behalf of the people who had decided 40 years ago that he was a thing to be owned. He set down the mug. Then the window beside the door exploded inward. The sound came first. Glass giving way is not one sound, but many, the initial impact, and then the cascade, the sound of something that held for a long time finally releasing all at once. Then the gunfire. Automatic, multiple sources, at least 3 separate weapons firing from different angles outside the difference in their positions, creating a kind of triangulation that a person who had spent time in places where this kind of thing happened would recognize immediately. Holt was off the counter stool before the second burst. He moved to Ruth, got his arm around her, dropped them both below the counter level as the second wave of rounds came through the window and the wall above where they had been sitting disintegrated into splinters and drywall dust. He pulled her low and kept her low, and his body was between her and the windows because that was where he put it without thinking about it, the same way water runs downhill, because it was what the moment required. The men at the back booths were up and moving. Decker and Rex came through the front from outside, the sound of their weapons answering the incoming fire. The diner filled with the particular chaos of a space that was designed for one purpose being used violently for another, chairs overturning the pie case, coming down the coffee pot, sliding off the counter, and hitting the floor with a sound that was almost comic in the context of everything else. Seamus was behind the counter with a weapon Holt had not seen him produce, returning fire through the gap below the window level, with the precise economy of a man who had done this before and did not need to see clearly to be effective. Rex's voice from outside. Taking fire from the east lot, at least 4 on the north side, 2 more coming around the building. Holt heard something in that, and it took him exactly 1 second to understand what he was hearing. The positions, the angles. The way the incoming fire was calibrated, not just for maximum damage, but for maximum coverage. This was not an improvised assault. This was a coordinated deployment by people who knew the layout, who had positioned themselves before the shooting started, who had chosen their angles with the specific intention of making sure there was no safe direction to move. And then from outside came a different sound. Closer. The crack of weapons that had a different register from the ones firing at them from the lot. Followed by Decker's voice cut short in a way that turned something cold in Holt's chest. "They're inside the wire. Brothers in the back lot. They're turning on us. The 12. Rex again strained now. We've got it. We've got it. Stay down." What followed was 90 seconds that Holt would not be able to fully reconstruct afterward, which was the nature of that kind of time. Time in which everything moves too fast for linear memory, and what you are left with afterward are images. Sounds the physical sensation of specific moments rather than their sequence. The weight of a body over another body. The smell of powder and rain through broken glass. The particular sound that wood makes when a round passes through it. The voice of a man you have ridden with for 6 years calling out a warning and then going silent. It ended. The shooting from outside stopped. The diner was smoke and rain, and the sound of its own damage settling the last of the broken glass sliding from a window framed the ceiling fan overhead, still turning, minus a blade, now its wobble more pronounced. Rex came in from the back, blood running from a cut on his forehead, his jacket torn at the shoulder, his eyes red with something that was not dust. They turned on us, he said. The 12, they came around from the back lot and tried to take us from behind. He stopped. Let the sentence finish itself in the silence. The 4 loyal men were standing. Injured, some of them, but standing. The 12 were not. Rex looked at Holt. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has done a thing that was necessary and will carry it for the rest of his life because necessary and easy are not the same thing, and he already knows this. Holt held his gaze. He said nothing, but he nodded once, slowly, with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what that nod was, acknowledging. Then from the back of the diner near the kitchen door came a sound that was not the settling of damage. 2 men came through that door, and they were not men who had been inside the diner when the shooting started. They wore dark clothing and moved with a specific kind of efficiency, and they carried weapons that were not the weapons of men who had come to scare anyone. Seamus came out of nowhere. He was faster than his 63 years had any right to allow. He cleared the counter, put himself between the 2 men and the door behind them, where Ruth had pressed herself against the wall, and he fired once. The first man went down. The second man was faster than the first. The shot caught Seamus in the chest. He went back against the counter. Stayed upright for a moment through what was probably nothing more than the momentum of what his body had been doing, the physical argument against gravity that the body makes for a second or two after the event that will end that argument. Then the counter caught him, and he slid down it. Holt fired 4 times. The second man collapsed. Holt crossed the room in 4 steps. He was on his knees beside Seamus before the man had finished sliding down the side of the counter, his hands finding the wound with the speed of someone who has done battlefield triage and knows that the first seconds are the only seconds that matter. The blood was coming too fast. He pressed down, hard, both hands, his weight behind it. Seamus looked up at him. His eyes were clear, fully present. The way a person's eyes are sometimes at the very end when the body has stopped its argument and the person inside is simply there without distraction, without the noise of physical complaint. Stay with me, Holt said. His voice was even. The trained voice. He set everything else down and used the trained voice because falling apart was something he would not do. Not here. Not now. I'm not finished with you yet. You stay with me. Seamus made a sound that might have been a laugh. He reached up, took hold of Holt's jacket, pulled him down until they were close enough that what he said next did not need to be loud. You are Jake Calloway, he said, son of David Calloway, son of Ruth Calloway, son of this place. He stopped, breathed, continued. I've known it for 3 years. I didn't tell you because you needed to find it for yourself. And you did. He paused again. You're the best man I've ever ridden with, son. Don't let them take that from you again. Either name. Both names. They're yours. His hand, which had been holding Holt's jacket, went slack. Holt kept his hands pressed against the wound for another moment, then another. Then he took them away. He stayed on his knees for a moment with his hands in his lap, looking at the man who had been his closest friend for 15 years, who had known his secret and had protected it and had carried it alone and had chosen the precise moment and the precise manner of giving it back, who had sat outside his door on a bad night in Albuquerque and not knocked and not said anything and had simply been there, which was the kind of thing that a person only does for someone they love. Holt stood up. His hands were covered in blood, and the room smelled like powder and rain and something else, something older, and Ruth was against the wall with her hands over her mouth, looking at him with eyes that held the specific grief of a woman who has just watched a good man die on behalf of the son she spent 40 years trying to find. Rex and Decker and Torch and Stone stood at the edges of the room, looking at Holt, waiting. Holt looked at his hands, then he looked at them. When he spoke, his voice had changed, not louder, not harder. Something had cleared out of it. The ambivalence, the uncertainty, the 58 years of not knowing what was at the center of himself and building everything around the absence. All of that was gone. What was left was very simple. He told them to get Ruth to the garage, to protect her, to not move from her side. They moved without question. Holt went to the counter, picked up his jacket, picked up the phone, dialed a number from memory. A number he had been given 4 months ago by a man in a bar in Phoenix who had introduced himself as an interested party and left the number without asking for one in return. The phone rang twice. FBI Phoenix Field Office. I need Agent Dorian Webb. A pause. Who's calling? Tell him it's about Garrett Holloway in Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. Tell him I have 40 years of evidence and I'm not planning on waiting much longer to hand it over. Another pause. Longer. Stay on the line. Holt stood in the broken diner in the rain coming through the missing windows and waited. He looked at the floor where Seamus had been and was not anymore. He looked at the pie case shattered, the apple filling spread across the linoleum. He looked at the slightly crooked photograph of the desert on the wall which had survived everything, which was still hanging, which would still be there when all of this was over. The voice on the phone changed. A different person now. Awake and focused in the way that people become awake and focused when they hear words they have been waiting to hear. This is Webb, Holt told him. Not everything. Enough. The shape of it, the names and the years and the mechanism of it. Webb listened without interrupting, which told Holt something about what kind of man Webb was and what kind of case he had been building and how long he had been building it. When Holt finished, Webb was quiet for 2 seconds. I've been working Holloway for 4 years, he said. Money laundering, tax structures. I can't make any of it stick. He's too clean on paper, too connected in the right rooms. Then you need what I have. What you're describing is human trafficking, murder, conspiracy going back decades. That's correct. What do you need from me? Holt looked at the door. At the parking lot beyond it, the neon light making red and gold on the surface of the standing water. At the darkness at the edge of the lot where a car had parked and gone dark earlier that night and had not, as far as he could determine, come back. I need you to arrest me, he said. Silence on the line. I need it public. Holt continued. I need it visible. Holloway needs to see it, and he needs to believe it. When he believes it, he'll think he's safe. When he thinks he's safe, he'll get sloppy. That's when I go in, with a wire, and I let him say everything he's been keeping in a locked room for 40 years. That's the worst plan I've ever heard, Webb said. Do you have a better one? The silence this time was longer. No, Webb said. Then get here fast. I have a crime scene and I have wounded, and I have 4 brothers who need to be gone before you arrive. The longer we wait, the worse all of it gets. Webb said, don't move anything. Don't touch the bodies. And Sullivan, Holt, whatever your name is. If this goes sideways in there, you understand there are limits to what I can do. I understand, Holt said. I stopped expecting other people to keep me safe a long time ago. He hung up. He looked at the 4 men who had come back from the garage and were standing in the doorway watching him. You need to be gone before they get here, he said. Take the bikes out the back road north Flagstaff. Seamus knew a man there. Auto shop on Birchwood. Tell him Patty sent you. He'll shelter you. Rex shook his head. We're not leaving you. You're not leaving me. You're protecting her. He looked at them steadily. If this goes wrong tonight, if I don't come back out of Holloway's place, then your job is to get Ruth Calloway somewhere that Holloway's people cannot find her. That is the mission. That is the only mission that matters. Rex held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor where Seamus had been. You bring that man down, Rex said. You hear me? Whatever it takes, you bring him all the way down. That's the plan, Holt said. Agent Dorian Webb was 52 years old and had the face of a man who had spent those years in the sustained company of people who lied to him professionally, which gave him a particular quality of stillness. When he listened, the stillness of someone who is not just hearing words, but measuring the distance between words and truth in real time. He arrived with 12 agents. He surveyed the diner with the methodical attention of a man who is making a calculation, while appearing to simply be looking. He looked at the damage to the walls. He looked at the floor. He looked at the body of Seamus Reardon and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor again for a moment with an expression that was not professional. Then he looked at Holt. You are going to need to tell me everything, he said. Holt told him, from the beginning, the coordinates, the diner, Ruth, the club, the 12, Gerald Holloway and Dr. Aldous Crane in Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital. The phone call with Eric Baylor from 3 years ago that Seamus had pieced together and held privately for 3 years out of care for the man he considered his closest friend. Webb listened, did not interrupt, did not take notes, which meant he was recording, which was fine. Holt had nothing to hide from recording. When it was done, Webb said 4 years. That's how long I've been watching Holloway's operation. Money moves shell companies' offshore accounts. Every time I get close, he shifts the structure and starts over. I can't get him on paper because the paper is always 3 shells deep before it touches anyone with a name I can use. He needs to say it himself, Holt said. He won't say it unless he thinks he's already won. That's why you need to arrest me. Now. Tonight. Webb looked at him. If you go in there and he decides to simply have you killed quietly rather than giving the speech, Webb said, there is nothing I will be able to do in time to prevent that outcome. I know. Then why would you do this? Holt looked at him without expression. Because she waited 40 years for someone to fix this, and no one did. Because Seamus Reardon just spent the last thing he had to make sure I knew who I was. Because there are 8 other people out there right now living inside a lie that was built around them the same way mine was, and the only way to find them is to pull this thing up from the root. He paused. And because I am done, he said, with being the loose end that someone else manages. Webb looked at him for a long moment. We'll wire you at the field office. State of the art. Undetectable at any scan his people are likely to run. We'll have units positioned 3 blocks from the estate. You go in, you get him talking, you get out. The moment you're clear, we move. And if I'm not clear, then we move anyway. Faster. Holt almost smiled. It did not quite arrive. The arrest was not subtle. Webb understood what Holt needed, and he delivered it with the efficiency of a man who knew how to perform for an audience that was not visible but was certainly watching. Handcuffs applied in the parking lot of the diner where the lights from the federal vehicles provided maximum visibility. A perp walked to the vehicle that lasted long enough to be observed and recorded by anyone positioned on the road with a phone or a pair of binoculars. A brief official statement from Webb to be fed to the Phoenix news cycle before dawn. Holt Dawson, president of the Iron Wolves MC Phoenix chapter, arrested in connection with multiple homicides at a rural diner on Highway 94. It would be on Holloway's phone before 7 in the morning. Holt sat in the back of the federal vehicle with his hands cuffed in front of him and looked out the window at the diner receding behind them. The neon sign was still going. Red and gold. Red and gold. One light cycling through its colors with the indifferent persistence of a machine that does not know anything has changed. The rain was beginning to lighten. He thought about Seamus, about the 15 years of riding together and the things you build without knowing you are building them, the accumulation of shared miles and shared difficulty and shared silence that adds up over time to something that does not have a name more specific than trust. The kind of trust that does not require articulation. The kind that simply exists like terrain, like weather, like the ground under your feet. He thought about what Seamus had said. Both names, they're yours. He looked at the tattoo on his wrist, the coordinates that had waited 10 years to be read. He pressed his thumb against them, the pressure enough to feel the slight difference in the skin where the ink had gone in the permanent record of a truth his body had known before his mind was ready to receive it. The field office appeared ahead, the federal building with its reliable institutional lighting, its flags, its suggestion that systems exist and function and will continue to function in the morning. Holt went inside. They took the cuffs off, brought him to a room with a table and 2 chairs and a 2-way mirror and a cup of coffee that was worse than the coffee at the diner, which was the coffee he would have for the rest of his life as the standard everything else was measured against. Webb came in with a small device in a sealed evidence bag and a technician who did not introduce himself and did not need to. The wire was smaller than anything Holt had expected. The kind of technology that made you understand why the technology you knew about was never the technology that actually mattered. The technician applied it with the speed and certainty of someone who had done it many times. Checked it twice. Checked it a 3rd time. Webb looked at Holt. Holloway Manor is 11 miles from here, he said. 20 acres. Gated approach. Security staff of at least 16 more at night. He will see you coming from the moment you hit the main road. Which means he'll know you're coming and he'll let you come because a man who has just watched his primary problem get arrested on the news does not see a lone visitor at his gate as a threat. He sees it as an opportunity to gloat. People who believe they've won Holt said tend to want someone to tell it to. Webb nodded. Get him talking about Holloway Sr., about Millbrook, about Lily Weston. He paused. If he tells you where Lily is. He stopped. If he tells you what happened to her, get out immediately. Don't push further. We'll have everything we need. Holt stood, picked up his jacket from the chair. One more thing, Webb said. Holt stopped. Whatever happens in there, Webb said. Whatever he shows you or tells you about who you are or what you did, I need you to remember what I'm about to tell you. Because I did not want to tell you this in his house on his terms. I wanted to tell you here on ours. He paused, organized what he was about to say. We have found in the sealed records from Millbrook Psychiatric Hospital reference to a pharmacological protocol administered to at least 9 patients in 1984 and 1985. The protocol involved the use of experimental compounds in combination with electroconvulsive therapy. The documented intention of the protocol was the suppression and eventual erasure of specific autobiographical memory. The identity of the individuals subjected to this protocol was until recently unknown. Holt waited. Your name appears in those records, Webb said, as a subject of that protocol, beginning in September of 1984. The records describe the administered substances, the frequency, the observed results. He stopped. You did not choose to forget who you were. It was done to you, without consent, without any legal or medical justification that exists outside of whatever arrangement Dr. Aldous Crane had made with Gerald Holloway. He paused one last time. Whatever Holloway shows you tonight, whatever he tells you you did or didn't do or were or weren't in, it was constructed, the memory, the guilt, the uncertainty, all of it built inside you on purpose, by people who needed you to be manageable. He looked at Holt steadily. You walked in here tonight knowing who your mother is and where you came from and what was taken from you, he said. Don't let him take that back. The room was quiet. Holt looked at the table, at the cup of bad coffee, at the reflection of the fluorescent light in its surface. Then he looked at Webb. How soon can I leave? Webb checked his watch. Whenever you're ready. Holt picked up his jacket, put it on, felt the familiar weight of it, the patch on the back. He was ready. He had been ready for 40 years without knowing what he was ready for. Now he knew. The countdown was at 8 hours and it was running, and whatever was going to happen at Holloway Manor, in the dark of this particular Arizona morning, was going to happen because Holt Dawson had made a decision, not in anger, not in grief, but with the steady and unambiguous clarity of a man who has finally, at the end of a very long road, found the thing that is worth fighting for. He walked out of the federal building into the thinning rain. The night had 2 hours left in it. He intended to use them. The Holloway estate sat 11 miles north of Phoenix on 20 acres of land that had been purchased in 1971 by Gerald Holloway for reasons that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with distance. Distance from neighbors. Distance from roads that carry traffic. Distance from the kind of casual observation that makes certain kinds of business difficult to conduct. The estate had grown over the decades in the way that money grows when it is not constrained by anything except appetite. The main house was 3 stories of pale stone and dark glass illuminated from below by ground lights that made it look less like a home than like something that was meant to be seen from a distance and to communicate to anyone looking the specific message that the people inside it were not the kind of people you approached without an invitation. Holt rode the last of the 11 miles alone. Rex and the others were gone north toward Flagstaff Ruth. Between them, the Sportster from the garage running clean and steady in a way that 40 years of careful maintenance made possible. He had watched them go. He had not watched for long. The ride through the thinning rain gave him time that he did not fill with thought. There was a kind of mental discipline that the road required, or that he required of himself on the road, a clearing out of everything except the immediate, the curve of the asphalt ahead, the weight of the bike under him, the distance of the lights in the darkness. He had been doing this for 25 years, and it was the most reliable method he had found for arriving at a difficult place in a useful condition. Not calm exactly, present. The gate came up in the headlight, black iron 12 feet high, set between stone pillars that had the look of things built to last longer than the people who ordered them. A camera on each pillar angled down, an intercom panel on the right side, a guardhouse behind the left pillar with a light on inside and a shadow moving behind the glass. Holt stopped the bike, sat on it in the rain with the engine idling. He looked at the camera on the left pillar for a long moment, letting it look back. Then he rode to the intercom and pressed the button. The response came in 4 seconds, a voice that was trying to sound like security, but had the particular quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing and is managing his reaction to its arrival. State your name and business. My name is Holt Dawson, Holt said. Tell Mr. Holloway I'd like a conversation. He'll understand what about. A pause longer than 4 seconds, long enough that somewhere in a room in that pale stone house, a decision was being made, long enough that Holt could hear beneath the rain and the idling engine the faint sound of his own heartbeat, which was steady. The gate opened. He rode through. The driveway was a quarter-mile of smooth asphalt through grounds that looked in the rain and the dark like the grounds of something that had always been here and always would be. Mature trees standing in the darkness like witnesses. Gravel borders. A fountain dry at this hour, its basin holding an inch of rainwater that reflected the lights of the house. He parked the bike at the base of the front steps, swung off, looked up at the house. The front door opened before he reached the top step. Garrett Holloway stood in the doorway. He was dressed as if he had not been to bed, or as if he had been to bed and had risen for this occasion with the kind of care that certain men take with their appearance, because the appearance is itself a form of argument. The suit was gray, the silver hair was in order. The face was composed into an expression of hospitable interest that did not reach the eyes. "Holt," he said, or should I say Jake? He let the name sit in the air between them like something he had been waiting to set down. "I wasn't certain you'd come. You knew I would." "Perhaps." Holloway stepped back from the door. "Please, come in." The entry hall was 2 stories of pale stone and dark wood, and the particular silence of large spaces that are maintained rather than lived in. A chandelier overhead, lit through the hour, did not require it. A staircase curving up to the right. Doors on 3 sides, all closed. A painting on the wall above the stairs, large in Arizona landscape, the desert at a time of day that was neither dawn nor dusk, but somewhere in between. Holloway led him through a door on the left into a study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the books arranged by size rather than subject, which told you something about their function. A desk of dark wood that was larger than necessary. 2 chairs facing each other across a low table, a decanter and 2 glasses on the table, the decanter already poured. "Sit," Holloway said. Holt remained standing. Holloway sat, crossed his legs, looked up at him with those colorless eyes. "Can I offer you a drink?" "No." Holloway picked up one of the glasses, held it without drinking. "You've caused me a considerable amount of inconvenience," he said. "The men tonight, the federal attention, the disruption to an arrangement that has been functioning smoothly for 25 years. He paused. "I find myself curious about what you expected to accomplish by coming here." "Answers," Holt said. Holloway smiled. "Of course. Answers." He set the glass down. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Your father. Millbrook. Lily. Weston. What was done to me and why." He paused. "All of it." Holloway looked at him for a moment. Then he reached to the side of his chair and lifted a laptop from the floor beside it and set it on the low table between them and opened it. The motion was unhurried. The motion of a man who has been waiting for this conversation and has prepared for it. "I'll tell you everything," Holloway said. "But first, as I said to you this evening, there's something you need to see." He turned the laptop so that the screen faced Holt. He pressed play. The footage was grainy in the way that security footage from 1984 is grainy. The resolution limited, the contrast too high, the edges of things bleeding into each other. But the content was clear enough. A room that had the particular institutional quality of a facility that is designed for compliance rather than comfort. A table, 2 chairs, and in one of those chairs a figure. Young, 18 at most, dark hair, a jaw that was recognizable the way certain features carry forward through decades and become the face you see in the mirror, the face that looks back at you in photographs, the face that is yours before you are old enough to have done anything with it. The boy's eyes were open, but they were not present. They were the eyes of someone who was in the room in the physical sense, but had been removed from the room in every other sense. Something had been done to whoever lived behind those eyes to create that particular kind of absence. A door opened in the footage. Another figure entered, smaller, a child, 7 years old, wearing a dress with a pattern that the camera could not resolve into specifics. Holloway's voice was even, conversational. "She was already sedated by the time she was brought in," he said. "Sodium pentothal administered during transport. My father's people were thorough about that. They needed a controlled environment for what came next." Holt watched the screen. The boy in the footage stood, moved to the child with the deliberate mechanical quality of someone who has been instructed rather than decided. The child did not move away because the child was no longer capable of moving away. The boy put his hands around the child's throat. "You were given a compound," Holloway said. "Experimental, not available through any approved channel. Dr. Crane had been developing it for 3 years before my father found a use for it. It made you entirely suggestible, entirely compliant. You would do exactly what you were told to do, and you would have no autonomous capacity to refuse or to deviate." He paused. "My father told you to kill her, and you did. Strangled her with your own hands. You were 18 years old and you murdered a 7-year-old child. The footage continued, which means Holloway said, his voice smooth and certain, as a man reading from a document he has already memorized, that you have always belonged to us. Everything you are, everything you think you've built, it exists because we allowed it to exist. Because a man who carries that kind of guilt in his body, even without knowing what the guilt is for, is a man who can be managed, who can be directed, who will never in the end be able to stand in the light and tell his story, because his story contains something that will destroy him. Holt was looking at the screen. He was looking at his own hands. He was looking at the hands of the boy in the footage, and he was looking at his own hands, and he was doing what a person does when they are trying to determine whether something is true or whether they are being shown something designed to look like truth. And he could not tell the difference. And that inability to tell the difference was the most frightening thing that had happened to him in a night full of frightening things. Because the doubt was there. Holloway had been right about that much. The doubt had been there for 58 years, shapeless, unnamed, the residue of an erasure so complete that what it left behind was not memory, but the absence of memory, not guilt, but the shadow that guilt casts when the thing that caused it has been removed. The nightmares, the fire, the screaming, the boy he had been before he was anyone else. What if the fire was not something done to him? What if the fire was something he had caused? He closed his eyes. 1 second. He thought about what Dorian Webb had told him 40 minutes ago in a room at the Federal Building. The sealed records, the documented protocol, the compounds, the electroconvulsive therapy, the observed results. His name in files that described what had been done to him as a procedure, as a methodology, as a thing that had been done with intention and plan, and the specific goal of making him into something that could be managed. He thought about Seamus on the floor of the diner. Both names, they're yours. He thought about Ruth at the counter. In her blood, in her bones, a mother knows. He opened his eyes. He looked at Garrett Holloway. He reached forward and picked up the laptop and brought it down on the side of Garrett Holloway's head. The sound it made was not the sound that movies suggest. It was harder and duller and more final than that. Holloway went sideways out of the chair. The decanter went over. The glass rolled off the table and did not break, which was perhaps because it was the kind of glass made to not break easily, the kind of glass that costs enough to be constructed for longevity. The door opened. 4 men, then 4 more. Then more behind them, emerging from rooms that had been occupied this whole time by people waiting for a signal. They were large, and they were fast, and they were equipped with the specific assurance of men who outnumber their opponent and know it, and have been told that the opponent is not someone who needs to be returned to the world in the same condition they arrived. What happened next was not the kind of thing that can be described in terms of sequence, because it did not proceed sequentially. It proceeded the way Desert Storm had proceeded, in the moments when the sequence broke down, and what remained was the body's knowledge of how to survive, which is older and faster and more reliable than the mind's knowledge when the mind is engaged elsewhere. Holt moved through them, not through all of them. There were too many, and he had a wound in his shoulder from earlier in the night that was making certain things more difficult than they would otherwise be. He was 58 years old, and he had been awake for 22 hours, and he had lost someone he loved in the diner 4 hours ago, and his hands were not entirely his own. He made it through 6 of them before the 7th caught him across the back of the head with something that had enough weight to it to change the situation. He went down. The floor was very smooth. He could feel the grain of the stone against his cheek. He heard Holloway's voice from somewhere above him. Closer now, the voice of a man who has just been hit with a laptop and is managing his reaction to that with imperfect success. Get him up. They got him up. Put him in the chair. The chair was still upright, apparently, which was more than could be said for the decanter. Holloway stood in front of him, a cut on his temple bleeding neatly, his suit disturbed but not destroyed. His expression had resolved from the hospitable interest it had worn at the door into something that had stopped performing. You came here alone, Holloway said. He was breathing harder than the circumstances strictly required. Your brothers don't know where you are. The FBI thinks you're still their managed asset. Your mother is somewhere in the dark hoping you come back. And you came here alone because you thought what exactly? That you could walk into my house and take something from me. He crouched slightly so that his face was at the level of Holt's. The colorless eyes were very close. You are what my father made you, he said. You are exactly what we needed you to be. A weapon that doesn't know it's a weapon is the most useful kind. And even now, knowing everything you think you know, You are still sitting in my chair in my house with my people around you because you came here alone, and that tells me everything I need to know about how lost you still are underneath all of it." Holt looked at him. "Pull the trigger," Holt said. His voice was even. "Prove you're exactly what your father made you." Holloway straightened. His jaw was tight. He reached into his jacket. The east wall came in. Not collapsed, not broken, but opened a door that was not visible as a door until it was being used, and through it came Agent Dorian Webb and 14 federal agents in tactical gear, and the kind of organized, efficient, overwhelming physical presence that answers questions about who is in charge of the room before any of those questions can be verbally posed. Webb had his weapon drawn. His eyes went to Holt, then to Holloway, then to the men around the chair, each of whom was doing the calculation that people do in those circumstances and arriving at the same conclusion. Nobody moved. Garrett Holloway, Webb said. His voice had the quality of a man who has been waiting to say something for 4 years and is now saying it with the deliberate pacing of someone who intends for each word to land correctly. "You are under arrest," he began the recitation. "The rights." The specific language of the legal moment read clearly and without inflection, because that was what the moment required, and Webb was a man who gave moments what they required. Holloway's men went down one by one as the agents moved through the room with the precision of people who had planned this specific entry for 4 years of preparation. Hands on the floor, zip ties, the sounds of compliance that follow when the math becomes undeniable. Holloway stood in the middle of all of it with his hands at his sides and his face working through something that it had not had to work through before. He looked at Holt. "You think this is over?" he said. "Yes," Holt said. An agent moved to Holloway and took hold of his arm. Holloway did not resist, but he turned his head to keep looking at Holt as they moved him toward the open door. "My father built this," he said. "Built all of it, made billions on the back of secrets that go deeper than anything your federal friends have in their files." "You really think one arrest ends that?" Webb stepped forward. "Your father is dead," he said. "His empire is dismantled, and you are going to spend the remainder of your life in a federal facility wondering whether any of it was worth what it cost." He paused. "Starting with this." He looked at Holt and gave a small nod. Holt looked at Holloway. "Where is she?" he said. "Lily Weston. Where is the body?" Holloway smiled. The smile of a man who has been stripped of most things but has decided to keep this one thing, this last card, because it is the only one he has left, and the holding of it is the only power remaining to him. "She's been under your mother's diner for 40 years, he said, "right under the foundation. Every cup of coffee that woman poured, every apple pie she baked, all of it on top of that little girl." He let the words arrange themselves in the air. "I think that's rather poetic, don't you?" Webb hit him, one clean punch open-handed to the side of the jaw. Holloway's head went sideways and he stepped to regain his footing, and the agent holding his arm held him up. "Apologies," Webb said. He slipped. They took Holloway out. The room was quieter now. Agents moving through it, photographing bagging, cataloging the evidence of a life built on the sustained destruction of other people's lives. The laptop on the floor, the decanter, the glass that had not broken. Webb came to Holt, looked at the shoulder, looked at the back of his head, where the bruise was already establishing itself. "You need medical attention," later Holt said. Webb looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down in the chair across from him, the chair Holloway had occupied. He sat forward with his elbows on his knees, which was not the posture of an official and was the posture of a man. "The video," Holt said. Webb nodded. "We pulled it from his system the moment we were inside the network. Our team had 40 minutes with it before you arrived." He paused. "It's a deepfake, constructed using footage from two separate sources. The image of the boy in the footage is composite. It is not you. The techniques used were sophisticated for 2024 and would have been impossible in 1984, which means it was constructed recently, specifically for this conversation, specifically to break you at the moment when you were closest to being able to destroy him." Holt was quiet. Webb reached into his jacket and removed a document in a clear evidence sleeve, placed it on the low table. "The coroner's report," he said, "from Millbrook, 1984, sealed for 40 years under a court order signed by a judge who, as of tonight, is also under federal investigation. The report states that Lily Weston died of a sodium pentothal overdose administered during transportation. Before she arrived at the facility, before anyone who was a patient at that facility had any interaction with her." He looked at Holt. "You didn't kill her," he said. "You were there. You were in that facility, but you did not kill her. You could not have killed her because she was already gone." The room was very still. Holt put his hands on his knees. He looked at them. The same hands he had looked at while the footage was playing. The hands of a man who had spent 58 years carrying the weight of something he had not done, could not have done the weight distributed through his entire life in the form of bad dreams and empty mornings and the persistent formless sense that he was something that required management. He breathed in. He breathed out. Webb said nothing. He understood that some things need to be breathed through before they can be spoken. After a while, Holt said, "She's under the diner." Webb nodded. "We'll begin the excavation tonight. Senator Weston has been notified. He's on his way." Holt stood, slowly. The shoulder was significant now that the adrenaline had completed its work and left. He moved to the window and stood with his back to the room, looking out at the grounds, at the fountain, standing in the rain, at the darkness at the edge of the estate where the desert resumed. He thought about Lily Weston, 7 years old in a dress with a pattern that a camera could not resolve, and a father who had spent 40 years not knowing where to go to stand and grieve. He thought about what it meant to be under the foundation of a diner, where a woman had made coffee and apple pie for 40 years above you, where a woman had kept the lights on and the doors open and had waited for a son who she believed in her bones was still breathing somewhere in the world. He thought that Ruth did not deserve to know this. And then he thought that Ruth deserved to know everything that was true because she had lived with enough things that were not true, and the truth, however hard, was something she had earned. He turned from the window. "Let's go," he said. The excavation took 4 hours. Webb's forensic team worked under lights brought in on generators, the rain holding off, now the sky beginning the long process of moving from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn in the desert. Ruth had been brought back from Flagstaff by Rex, who had received the call from Webb's office and had driven through what remained of the night to get her back to the place that was hers. She stood at the edge of the excavation with her hands in the pockets of her coat, and she watched them work. She did not cry. She had, Holt thought, used a great deal of what she had in the years of waiting, and what remained was a steadiness that was not the absence of feeling, but the long disciplined practice of feeling without being destroyed by it. Holt stood beside her. They did not speak for a long time. When the forensic team made the confirmation and Webb came to them with the news in the careful language of a man who has delivered difficult information many times and has learned that the care of the delivery matters, even when the content cannot be changed, Ruth nodded. She looked at the ground. She pressed her lips together. "She was 7 years old," Ruth said. "Yes," Webb said. "She was someone's daughter." "Yes," Ruth looked up at him. "And someone knew where she was this whole time. Someone knew and made it possible for the people above her to go on not knowing." Webb held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's why tonight matters. Why what your son did tonight matters." Ruth looked at Holt. He met her eyes. She reached out and took his hand. Not the gesture of someone who needs support. The gesture of someone giving it. Senator Elias Weston arrived before dawn. He was 76 years old, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent decades in public life, the particular posture of someone who has learned to take up space without apology. But he had driven himself. No security, no aid. Just an old man who had received a phone call in the middle of the night telling him that his daughter had been found after 40 years and who had needed to get in a car and drive. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at what the lights revealed, and he did not speak for a long time. His shoulders were very still, the way a person's shoulders are still when they are holding everything they have inside. Holt crossed the lot to him, stood beside him, said nothing. After a while, Weston said, "She liked apple pie." Holt looked at him. Lily Weston said, "She was 7 years old and she had very specific opinions about food, and apple pie was at the top of the list, with extra cinnamon." He stopped. She would have argued with anyone who left out the cinnamon. Holt felt something move through him, something that had no name but was connected to things that had happened earlier in the evening, to a plate of pie set in front of him, without being asked, to the particular rightness of a taste that his body had recognized before the rest of him was ready to understand what that recognition meant. He said, "There's a woman who's been making apple pie in this diner for 42 years. Weston looked at him. "With extra cinnamon," Holt said. The old senator looked at the diner, at the lights still burning inside, at the shape of a woman visible through the window, standing at the counter, waiting the way she always waited. He turned and walked toward the diner. Holt followed at a distance, gave them space. Watched through the broken window as the old man came through the door, and Ruth looked up from the counter, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And then Weston said something very quietly, and Ruth came around the counter, and these two people who had each lost someone they loved to the same act of violence, who had each spent 40 years not knowing, who had each kept going anyway because there was nothing else to do, held each other in the middle of the broken diner while the dawn came up outside. Holt stood in the parking lot and watched the sky change. Rex came to stand beside him, did not speak, just stood there, which was the thing that mattered. After a while, Holt said, "He died knowing." Rex did not ask who. He said, "Yeah, he did. That's not nothing." "No," Rex looked at the schema. "That's everything." They stood there until the sun came all the way up. 6 months passed the way time passes after something that divides a life into before and after. Not quickly and not slowly, but with a particular texture of time that is being used rather than merely spent. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And Holt, who had spent 25 years understanding that purpose, was not something that arrived on its own, but something that had to be constructed through the sustained application of effort to things that mattered, went to work. Calloway's diner was rebuilt in 10 weeks. The framing crew included Rex and Decker and Torch and Stone, all of whom had apparently decided without consulting each other that the particular chapter of their lives that had involved writing was not over, but that the chapter involving writing for the Iron Wolves MC Phoenix chapter was definitively closed. Rex managed the construction with the efficiency of a man who had once organized the logistics of moving 11 motorcycles through 3 states without a paper trail, which turned out to be adequate preparation for organizing a construction project in the Arizona desert. Community volunteers came. The story had gotten out in the way that stories get out in small communities, where the particular human hunger for meaning finds the stories that carry it. A woman who had kept a diner open for 40 years waiting for her son. The son who had come home after 40 years not knowing he was looking for home. People came with tools and with food and with the simple desire to be part of something that pointed toward the possibility that things could be repaired. The foundation was new. Clean concrete poured over clean ground, the excavation completed and documented, and the remains of Lily Weston returned to her family for burial in the way that had been denied for 4 decades. Senator Weston came to the groundbreaking. He stood with a shovel in his hands and he said something short and he drove it into the ground and he looked at Holt and he nodded the kind of nod that carries everything that cannot be said. The sign above the door was Ruth's idea. She had written it on a piece of paper in the handwriting that she had been using since before Holt was born, the handwriting that had written notes in his school lunchbox and grocery lists on the refrigerator and a letter every year on his birthday, to an address she did not have letters she had kept in a box, that she showed him one evening in the 2nd month after his return when she thought he was ready to see them, and was right. The sign said Calloway's Homecoming Diner, where lost souls find family. Rex had the letters made in steel and mounted them himself with Decker holding the level. Inside, the counter was restored to the dimensions and the height in the particular surface quality of the original, which Rex had documented in photographs before the demolition, so that it could be reproduced correctly. The booths were rebuilt in the same configuration. The pie case was new glass. The coffee pot was the same model because Ruth had strong opinions about coffee pots and had identified the correct model through what Torch described as 3 hours of online research that would have been more efficient if she had allowed anyone to help her. The ceiling fan was replaced. All the blades were present. The photograph of the Arizona desert in its wooden frame was the only object that had survived the attack without damage. It hung on the rebuilt wall, slightly crooked, exactly as it had always been. Holt had straightened it twice, and Ruth had tilted it back both times without comment. On the morning of the grand opening, Holt stood in the parking lot and looked at the building and felt something that he did not immediately have a word for. He worked through the words he knew. Pride was part of it, but too small. Gratitude was part of it, but pointed the wrong direction. He settled eventually on something that was not a single word, but a sentence. This is what stays. Not the men who tried to erase it, not the 40 years of absence, not the lies built around the absence. What stayed was the woman inside who had made coffee and pie for 4 decades and had never stopped believing that the person she was making it for would eventually come through the door. What stayed was the door. Agent Dorian Webb arrived at the opening, out of uniform, dark jeans and a jacket that fit him like a man who had found it on a rack rather than had it made, which was accurate. He drank Ruth's coffee with the expression of a man who has been drinking federal building coffee for 20 years and has just been reminded that there is a difference. He sat with Holt in the booth nearest the door, which was Holt's booth, which everyone understood was Holt's booth without its being stated. Garrett Holloway's trial starts in 3 weeks, Webb said. I know. 3 consecutive life sentences is the projection. The evidence from the estate alone would be sufficient, but with the Millbrook records and the financial documentation and the testimony of Dr. Aldous Crane, who had in the event found cooperation to be the most useful option available to an 84-year-old man facing federal charges, it was beyond reasonable challenge. Dr. Crane Holt said, "Is alive," Webb said, "in custody, cooperating fully." He paused. He confirmed the identities of all 9 subjects from the 1984 and 1985 protocols. He has provided everything he has. The documentation, the records, the methodology. He stopped. It is Holt one of the more significant pieces of evidence I have encountered in 24 years of federal work. Holt looked at his coffee. "The 8, he said. Webb reached into his jacket, placed a folder on the table. He looked at Holt steadily. "One has been identified and located," he said, "living in Albuquerque under the name Raymond Davis, 44 years old, former Army 2 tours, works in auto repair." He paused. "Has nightmares every night, does not know why, has no memory of who he was before the age of 7. Holt was quiet. "The other 7 are more complicated," Webb said. "Different facilities, different years, different methodologies as the protocol evolved. We have partial documentation for 6 of them, and essentially nothing for the 7th except a name in Crane's notes and a year." He paused. "It will take time, and it will require someone who understands what these people experienced, who can recognize what it looks like from the inside." He looked at Holt. "I can't force this," Webb said. "You've done more than anyone had any right to ask. But I am asking, because what you know, what you carry, it is not something that a badge provides. And these people deserve to be found by someone who knows what it means to be lost the way they're lost." Holt looked out the window. At Highway 94, which was dry today, the desert light flat and white on the asphalt. At the cars passing in both directions, each one carrying someone somewhere, each one a life in motion that he knew nothing about. He thought about sitting in a motel room in Phoenix every morning for 25 years, breaking down the Colt and assembling it again, the coordinates on his wrist pointing at a place he was not ready to go. He thought about riding 100,000 miles looking for something he could not name. He thought about the pie, about the extra cinnamon that his body had known was right before his mind had any language for why. He thought about Seamus. A man has to stand on his own truth. He looked at Webb. "Tell me about Raymond Davis," he said. "Start from the beginning." Webb opened the folder. Behind them the door opened and the bell above it chimed. Rex, who was behind the counter pouring coffee with the focused attention of a man taking his new job seriously, looked up. A young man came in, 25 years old perhaps. Dark blonde hair, pale blue eyes, the particular bearing of someone who is uncertain of the welcome they are going to receive in any room they enter, and has learned to hold themselves slightly apart while they assess. He stopped inside the door, looked at the counter, at the booths, at the sign Ruth had put on the wall behind the counter, framed in the same kind of wood as the desert photograph. "Where lost souls find family." He read it twice. Ruth came out from the kitchen. She looked at the young man with the same eyes she had looked at everything with for 42 years. The eyes that were waiting for something, though, what they were waiting for had changed. "Sit down, honey," she said. "Coffee and pie first, everything else after." The young man sat at the counter. Ruth poured the coffee. The smell of apple and cinnamon moved through the room. Holt watched from the booth. He turned back to the folder on the table. To Webb, who was waiting. To the name written at the top of the first page. Raymond Davis, Albuquerque, New Mexico. He pressed his thumb to the page. He thought about a man in Albuquerque who woke up every morning from a dream he did not understand, in a life that fit him well enough but not perfectly, in a name that was his, because someone had decided it was his rather than because it was. A man who walked around with coordinates on his skin that he had never thought to look up. A man who was at this moment having his coffee and going to work and living inside a story that someone else had written for him. The way Holt had done for 40 years. The way he was not doing anymore. He looked up at Ruth, who was talking to the young man at the counter with the ease of a woman who had been doing this for 42 years, who had given coffee and tea in the specific warmth of this particular room to thousands of strangers, and had asked nothing of any of them except that they stay long enough to be human with each other. He thought about the letters she had written every year on his birthday to an address she did not have. 40 letters. 40 years of the same act repeated, not because it was useful, not because it would be received, but because it was the truest expression of something that did not require a recipient to be real. He thought about that being the most courageous thing he had ever learned about another person. He closed the folder, set it on the seat beside him, stood up from the booth. Webb looked at him. Give me an hour, Holt said. He crossed the diner to the counter. The young man at the counter looked up. He had the look of someone who had driven a distance to arrive here and was not entirely certain what he had expected to find. I'm Holt, Holt said. He sat down on the stool beside him. The young man looked at him. Something in his face was uncertain, and something was relieved, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying a question alone and has just found themselves in a room where the question might be answerable. Nolan, he said. Nolan Weston. My grandfather was Senator Elias Weston. My great-aunt was Lily. I know, Holt said. The senator told me about you. He said you'd come. Nolan looked at the counter. I grew up in the shadow of what happened to her, he said. My family was never the same after. My grandfather was never the same. I grew up knowing that this absence was the shape everything else was built around. He paused. And then you found her. Brought her home. He stopped. I don't know what to do with gratitude that size. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what did you want to do before you drove here today? Not what you thought you should do, what you wanted. Nolan looked at him. Find the others, he said. The people like you, the ones who were taken and don't know it yet. He paused. I want to help bring them home. Holt looked at Ruth. She was already looking at him. She gave him the small nod that was also a smile, the expression of a woman who has seen enough of what she hoped to see to know that the rest of it is going to be all right. He looked back at Nolan. Welcome to the family, Holt said. Rex from behind the counter poured a third cup of coffee, set it in front of Holt without being asked. Decker appeared from the kitchen doorway with an apple pie on a white plate, the lattice crust the precise shade of gold that required knowing exactly when to open the oven door. Set it on the counter. Holt looked at the pie. Extra cinnamon, Decker said. The way it's supposed to be. Later that afternoon, 3 files arrived by secure courier from Webb's office. 3 faces, 3 names. 3 separate lives being lived in separate cities by people who did not know at this moment that those lives had been constructed around them rather than grown from within them. Holt spread the files on the booth table. Rex came to look. Decker leaned over from the adjacent booth. Nolan, who had spent the afternoon listening more than speaking, which Holt took as a promising quality in a person, pulled his chair close. Torch and Stone came in from outside and sat down. They looked at the 3 faces. Which one first, Rex asked. Holt looked at each file, at the photographs paperclipped to the top of each one, at the names below the photographs, at the cities. He thought about Raymond Davis in Albuquerque, who had nightmares every night and did not know why. He thought about a person waking up in the dark in a life that was real enough, but never entirely theirs, reaching for something they could not name, living at the edge of a knowledge they had not been allowed to have. He thought about what it would mean to have someone come and say, I know what this is. I know where you come from. I know who was waiting for you and has been waiting all this time. He looked up. All 3, he said. We don't stop until they come home. Every single one. Rex nodded, stood, went to the counter for the coffee pot. Outside, the sun was going down over the Arizona desert, the sky doing what the Arizona sky does, at the end of the day becoming something that does not have adequate language. The colors moving through a range that begins with gold and ends somewhere past crimson and holds in between it. Everything that the day was and could have been and still might become. Highway 94 moved below it. The cars and the trucks and the motorcycles going north and south, each of them carrying someone, each of them a life in motion, some of them heading towards something they knew, and some of them heading towards something they didn't yet. Holt stood at the window, the same window, the window where a boy named Jake had stood every night before bed and told his mother he was going to ride across the whole country someday. See everything, go everywhere. Ruth came to stand beside him, put her hand on his arm. You used to stand at this exact window, she said, every night. Told me you were going to ride across the whole country someday. Maybe I already did, he said. She looked at him with those eyes that had done their waiting and were now doing something else. Something that looked from the outside like the specific piece of a person who has been right about something for 40 years and has finally been shown the proof. You came back, she said. That was always the part I knew. I just didn't know when. Holt looked at the highway, at the long, flat line of it going north into the dark. He thought about the coordinates on his wrist pointing here for 10 years, while he rode every road in America looking for something he could not name. He thought about the pin on the map dropping onto this exact spot, and the way he had gone down on one knee in the rain in the parking lot outside, and the way the neon had cycled through its colors above him, red and gold. Red and gold, while the thing he had been running from turned out to be the thing that had been waiting to find him. He thought about Seamus sitting outside a door in Albuquerque on a bad night, not knocking, not speaking, simply present. He thought about Ruth making apple pie above the ground where a little girl had been for 40 years, not knowing, making it the way she always made it with the extra cinnamon for the son she believed was coming back. He thought about the 8 people out there right now in their separate cities, in their constructed lives, waking up from dreams they didn't understand, living at the edge of a knowledge they hadn't been given permission to have. From inside the diner, Rex's voice. Hey, phones are ringing. Webb just sent 2 more files. Holt turned from the window. Ruth took her hand from his arm. She looked at him for a moment with the full brightness of what she had been holding for 40 years. And then she turned toward the kitchen, toward the oven, where the next pie was waiting, toward the work that she had been doing and would continue to do in this place that had held the shape of a family through all the years the family was missing. Holt walked back to the booth, sat down, opened the files. The narrator's voice one last time, slow and certain, the voice of someone speaking from the far side of all of it. Some roads only make sense when you look back at them. Holt Dawson had ridden every highway in America looking for something he couldn't name. Turns out it had been waiting at the end of Highway 94 the whole time, in a diner that smelled like coffee and apple pie and 40 years of a mother's love. He had been lost a long time. But lost things, if they are lucky, find their way home. And some men, the ones who are paying attention, find out that home was not the place they left. It was the place that never stopped believing they were coming back. The sign above the door glowed against the desert night. Callaway's Homecoming Diner, where lost souls find family. The road stretched out in both directions, long and straight, and full of people who did not yet know they were being looked for. Holt bent over the files. He got to work.